Hello and welcome to another session at ORF Middle East. I'm Samriddhi Vij and I'm an Associate Fellow for Geopolitics at ORF Middle East. Today we are joined by Matthias Caton, who's the Managing Director of German Maritime Centre. Thank you so much, Matthias, for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we are discussing a very important topic on the sidelines of the Raisina Dialogue El Khalifa, which is how do we secure our seas? The Middle East's maritime landscape is shaped by a strategic position in the global trade routes, particularly key choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. These waterways carry a significant share of the global trade and are critical to global supply chain. Given the region's global geopolitical volatility, the security of these maritime corridors is very important, both regionally as well as internationally. So, on that note, my first question to you is, with the rising threats to these maritime checkpoints, how effective are the current security frameworks in protecting global trade, and where do you see the biggest gaps?
Well, I think if we talk about global shipping and logistics chains, as you've rightly pointed out, they rely on an uninterrupted flow of goods and ships for that matter. And there are a few choke points. Some of them happen to be in the Middle East. There are also others in other parts of the world that are, due to their mostly geographical nature, prone to disruptions, either involuntary through accidents, for example, or through voluntary acts. And if we talk about these voluntary acts, it gets a bit complicated because you see we're faced with different kinds of actors. We have traditional, let's say, non-state actors. Think of pirates, for example, operating off the coast of Somalia, to give you one example. We have quasi-state actors, such as the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are not state actors, but they are quasi-state because they control a share of the territory of a country, in this case, Yemen. And then, of course, we have very traditional state actors, such as Iran, who have been known to mingle and to disrupt shipping in the Gulf region, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz. So all those different types of disruptions or actors require different types of answers, and that makes it a bit complicated.
Right. So I think you did mention a lot of different actors, including non-state actors as well as state actors. But what about the private sector? What do you think is the role of the private sector in ensuring security and also protecting the global trade? Because they are a large part of facilitating this global trade.
Yeah, I think the role of the private sector in security issues, for good reasons, should always be rather limited. So I think there is a good reason for the concept that exists in most developed countries, that the state has a monopoly on security issues, and it's not up to private actors to make up their own security. Now, when it comes to international shipping, of course, things are a bit different because ships are operating in international waters. They're often far from both national jurisdictions, but also far from the access or the resources of individual states. So shipping companies have taken very, very different measures. Some of them have armed their ships, or they have contracted private security in different ways. Others have refrained from that. I think, generally speaking, if you're talking about the bigger picture, what can the private sector do? I would say it's not their role. So they're reacting to those threats by, for example, rerouting their ships. We've seen this with the threat from the Houthi rebels, where most shipping companies, not all, but most, have decided to reroute their ships, go around the Horn of Africa, which again, is a problem because it takes much longer, it's more costly, has an environmental impact. But they're basically just reacting, and I think the role to solve or contain these issues should lie, for good reasons, with countries, with the states.
Okay, so that's very interesting. You mentioned rerouting of the ships, and we've seen those patterns emerge significantly. Do you think these patterns are here to stay, or what do you think is the forecast of that?
I think shipping companies have shown that they're very flexible in the sense that they react very quickly to perceived changes in the threat environment or the assessment of the threat. So I don't think it's going to stay in a particular way forever. It's going to fluctuate. Also, different companies will be taking different decisions, maybe also depending on where they come from, because we've seen that the threat level for ships differs. So the Houthis have been known to attack ships from certain countries and not so much from others. So that depends a little bit on that. But I think we'll see a lot of volatility. And let's not forget, I mean, we're talking now about voluntary acts of disruption, but we've also seen accidents. Think of what happened when the container ship Evergrande blocked the Suez Canal, which that was an accident, so it was not an act of terror or anything like that, but it had similar effects. So it forced shipping companies to reroute. So I think we'll see that, and as long as there is a way to reroute, the effects will always be temporary. So there might be temporary disruptions. There might be cost implications, of course, that will be passed on to customers whenever possible, but there will be solutions.
Okay. So you did say that the role of the private sector should remain limited in ensuring security of these routes. But what about the role of emerging technologies? What about AI? What about satellite surveillance, cybersecurity to strengthen security? Do you think this is important? And do you think governments are doing enough to leverage these technologies?
Certainly, technology can play a major role when it comes to surveillance and intelligence gathering. You mentioned drones, you mentioned satellite images that are becoming increasingly better. Of course, AI, which can help analyze those data points. So that will certainly help. Now, surveillance, of course, is only part of the game. So surveillance means that you know what's going on, but ideally you want to be able to react, and that's a completely different ballgame, and that requires resources, mostly naval resources, ships in those areas that help patrol the areas. And that is, depending on where you're looking at and the scope of the geographical region, that is quite challenging. What I do think is important to note is that I think this is a role for every trading country. So far, most of the activities that we've seen on a military basis have been undertaken by developed countries, by the West, basically. Different kinds of alliances, sometimes led by the US, sometimes led by Europe. But I think increasingly countries such as India, by the way, should become part of those security alliances and help maintain those shipping lanes open.
Right. So that is a little bit on what is currently happening and what are the emerging trends that you see. So my final question to you is, in the next 5 years, what is your sort of forecast on the biggest emerging trends in maritime security? And what do you think the policymakers need to prepare themselves for?
Well, that is a very difficult question, of course. Foresight is always difficult, especially in volatile times such as the ones that we live in. So I'm really struggling to give you an exact prediction. I think volatility is going to stay. And that also means that we don't really know where the next security challenge is going to arise. It could be in the Middle East, could be also somewhere else, right? I mean, if we look at Asia, things might develop in one way or another in the South China Sea. They might develop in one way or another vis-a-vis Taiwan, for example. So there's a lot of things that we don't really know. And we've seen that with the incoming US administration. Even things that we thought they were cast in stone alliances that date back decades and were thought to be very, very stable have now been appended in a relatively short amount of time. So I think it's really, really difficult to predict where exactly the conflicts will pop up in the next 5 years.
Right. And I think that is, what we really need to be trying to resolve for in the region, developing foresight. So thank you so much for a very insightful conversation. I really